The stagecoach lurched to a stop in a cloud of burnt orange dust, and Abigail Rose Whitaker gripped the doorframe with both hands before stepping down onto the main street of Harrow Creek, Montana territory. Her boot heel caught the bottom step, and she stumbled slightly just enough to catch the attention of the small crowd gathered near the post office. She heard it before she had fully straightened herself. "Good Lord," a man's voice pitched just loud enough to carry. "Walker paid for a wife and got two." Laughter followed, low, unhurried, the kind of laughter that had been used so many times it required no effort at all. A few people looked away. A few didn't bother. Abigail stood still for a moment with her worn leather suitcase hanging from one hand and the afternoon sun beating down on the back of her neck. She was 28 years old. She had traveled 4 days by rail and 2 more by coach from Missouri, eating biscuits wrapped in cloth and sleeping upright against a window that rattled without ceasing. She had rehearsed the moment of arrival so many times in her imagination that she had worn it smooth, the handshake, the polite introduction, the cautious beginning of something new. She had not rehearsed this. The town of Harrow Creek spread itself along a single main street that widened into a modest square near the livery, a general store, a post office with warped siding, a church with a fresh coat of white paint that hadn't quite dried evenly, a saloon with red curtains in the windows. Behind all of it, the land opened into a vast bowl of grass and sky that went on until it met the mountains still capped with snow despite the heat. It was beautiful in the way that beautiful things sometimes are indifferent to whether you noticed. Abigail noticed. She noticed the mountains, and she noticed the laughter, and she kept her chin level. A woman standing near the water trough leaned toward another and whispered something, without whispering, quietly enough. Abigail caught 2 words: mail order, and then something that made the second woman cover her mouth. On the boardwalk outside the general store, a teenage boy elbowed his friend. Neither was old enough to know better, but both were old enough that someone should have taught them. She was used to this. That did not mean it stopped hurting. It meant only that she had learned where to put the hurt folded small, tucked somewhere below the breastbone, where it could not be seen on her face. She had been putting it there since she was 11 years old, and a boy at school had called her the wide one, and the name had stuck through 2 years of Sunday school and 3 county fairs before her family finally moved to a different part of the county. She scanned the street for Caleb Walker. She knew his name from the letters, brief formal letters, 4 of them, over 3 months, written in a steady hand that told her he was careful with words. He had described the ranch, the land, the cattle. He had described his expectations with the same plainness a man might use to describe the terms of a business arrangement. She had understood that. She had not expected poetry. She had expected a fair chance. A man appeared from between the livery and the feed store, walking toward the stagecoach with his hat in his hand. He was tall, taller than she had imagined, with dark hair going gray at the temples and a jaw that looked like it had been cut rather than grown. His clothes were clean but well worn, the way the clothes of a working man always are. He moved with the unhurried certainty of someone who owned the ground he walked on, which she supposed he very nearly did. He was looking at her. She watched his face. She had spent enough of her life watching people's faces at the moment they first saw her that she had become accurate at reading the transitions, the flicker of assessment, the recalibration of expectation, the decision about whether to be polite or not, bother. His face did all of those things in about 2 seconds, and then he stopped walking entirely, some 6 feet away, and put his hat back on. "There must be some mistake," he said. The words were quiet. He hadn't meant for them to carry, she thought. But the street was not very large, and the crowd had not dispersed, and a mistake apparently was what he had made. Abigail held her suitcase with both hands in front of her and said, "Mr. Walker?" "Miss Whitaker." He cleared his throat. "My sister, she handled the correspondence. I didn't see a photograph." "There wasn't one included," Abigail said. "I didn't think it would matter." He looked at the ground for a moment, and then back at her. And in that moment, she understood that it mattered. Not to him in the way that cruelty matters. She could see he wasn't a cruel man. But the picture he had assembled in his imagination and the woman standing before him on the main street of Harrow Creek were not the same picture, and she could see him sorting through that. She had come a long way. She was very tired. "Is there somewhere I can sit down?" she asked. It was a long ride. He took her to the ranch in a wagon that smelled of hay and something faintly medicinal, which she later learned was the salve he used on the cattle's hooves in dry season. They drove in near silence for 20 minutes along a road that ran between low hills covered in switchgrass before the Walker Ranch opened up on the right, A white farmhouse with a wide porch. 3 outbuildings, a barn the color of dried blood and cattle, so numerous she couldn't see the far edge of the herd. A young woman was waiting on the porch steps. She was perhaps 23, with Caleb Walker's dark coloring and the eager expression of someone who has arranged something they are now somewhat afraid of. She came down the steps quickly and extended her hand. "Miss Whitaker, I'm Clara Walker. I arranged, that is, I wrote to the agency on my brother's behalf." She glanced sideways at Caleb. "I hope the journey wasn't too awful." "It was fine," Abigail said. "Caleb," Clara's voice carried a warning that had been rehearsed. "I'll put the wagon up," he said, and kept walking. Clara watched him go with the expression of a woman who had expected this and was determined not to let it derail the plan. She turned back to Abigail with a smile that was genuinely warm, which Abigail appreciated, even as she understood that warmth from the sister was not the same thing as welcome from the man. "Come inside," Clara said. "I'll show you the house. Are you hungry?" "I could eat," Abigail said. The kitchen was large and well appointed for a frontier house, a proper iron range, a deep sink, shelves of preserves that had not been restocked in at least 2 years, judging by the dates on some of the labels. The pantry was organized but sparse. The dining table could seat 8 and had been set for 3. Clara talked while she heated soup from a pot on the back of the stove, telling Abigail about the ranch, the hands, the seasonal rhythms, the way the winters could turn serious by November. And Abigail listened and watched the door and waited for Caleb Walker to come in from the barn. He came in 20 minutes later, washed his hands at the sink without looking at anyone, and sat down at the head of the table. They ate. Clara carried the conversation alone, which required some skill and more determination. Caleb ate steadily and said 3 things during the entire meal: that the soup needed salt, that one of the south fence lines needed repairing before the week was out, and that he had work in the morning. After supper, while Clara was washing up, he appeared in the doorway of the sitting room, where Abigail had been looking at the bookshelves. Real books, she noted, not just almanacs, which told her something. "Miss Whitaker," he said. She turned. He had his hat in his hands again, which she was beginning to understand was what he did when he was preparing to say something difficult. "I owe you an apology for what happened in town. What that man said, it wasn't right." "No," she agreed. "It wasn't." He nodded, accepting this. "I also need to be honest with you. Clara acted without my full knowledge. I'm not—" He stopped. "I had a wife 6 years ago. I'm not in a position to offer what you came here expecting." "What was I expecting?" He looked at her steadily. "A husband, a real one." "I was expecting a fair chance," she said. "That's all I came for, a fair chance somewhere." He turned the hat in his hands. "I can give you the month. Stay through the month, and I'll pay your way back to Missouri with enough left over to get yourself settled somewhere." She thought about Missouri. She thought about the house she'd left, her father's house, technically, though it had never felt like hers. She thought about the letter she'd received 6 days ago, the one still folded inside her coat that she had not yet allowed herself to fully think about. "All right," she said, "the month." He put his hat on and went to bed. Clara showed her to the spare room, which had a window that faced east and a quilt that had been recently shaken out. There was a small writing table and a pitcher and basin and a rag rug on the plank floor. It was plain and clean, and Abigail had slept in worse places. She sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself, for the first time since stepping off the stagecoach, to feel the full weight of the day. It settled on her chest like something physical. The man's voice on the street got 2, and the laughter in Caleb Walker's face doing that quick calculation, and there must be some mistake said quietly enough that he hadn't meant for it to hurt, and yet it had, and she supposed she had known it would hurt, regardless of how quietly it was said, because the truth of a thing doesn't depend on the volume. She did not cry. She was too tired to cry, and she had learned a long time ago that crying alone in a strange room was the least useful thing she could do with the feeling. She unpacked her suitcase methodically. Her 2 good dresses hung on the hooks behind the door. Her sewing kit, her Bible, her copy of Jane Eyre with the cracked spine. Her mother's hairbrush with the ivory handle, which she had taken when her mother died and kept through everything since. She set the brush on the writing table and looked at it for a moment. Then she lay down on top of the quilt in her dress and fell asleep before the lamp had stopped guttering. She woke before 5. The house was dark and still, but outside she could hear the ranch stirring, the low sound of cattle, a horse moving in the barn, the creak of the bunkhouse door. She dressed quickly and went to the kitchen. The stove was cold. The coffee tin was empty. There was flour in the bin and lard in the crock and eggs in the basket by the door that someone had brought in the previous evening. She found salt pork hanging in the pantry and a jar of dried beans and a crock of last year's preserved peaches that were still good. She made biscuits. She had been making biscuits since she was 8 years old, standing on a stool in her grandmother's kitchen in the farmhouse outside Independence. And she had learned from a woman who believed that biscuits were a form of argument, that you could say things with biscuits that you couldn't say with words, that a good biscuit was a kind of proof. Proof that you were there, that you were capable, that you intended to stay. While the biscuits baked, she made coffee from a fresh tin she found behind the preserves and fried salt pork and scrambled a dozen eggs in the drippings. When the first ranch hand came to the door at 5:30, drawn by the smell, she had everything laid out on the long table in the kitchen. He was a young man, maybe 20, with a gap in his front teeth and freckles that the sun had been working on for years. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the table and then at Abigail. "You're the—" He caught himself. "The cook's been sick." "Sit down," she said. "There's enough." He sat down. Two more came in behind him, then a fourth. By the time Caleb Walker appeared in the kitchen doorway at 5:55, there were 6 ranch hands eating at his table, and the sound in that kitchen was different than the sound he was used to. Not just the noise of men eating, but something easier. Something that involved one of the men laughing at something the woman at the stove had said while she refilled the coffee pot. He looked at the table and then at Abigail. She handed him a cup of coffee without comment. He took it and sat down. He ate 3 biscuits. She noticed because she noticed everything that he didn't mention them. After breakfast, she walked the kitchen garden. It was on the south side of the house, walled on 2 sides by the outbuildings, and it had been seriously neglected, not this season only, but over several seasons. There were the remnants of beds that had once been properly laid out, but they had gone to grass and weed, and what few things were still growing were leggy and untended. A rosebush near the east wall had survived on pure stubbornness and was putting out a handful of small yellow blooms that the neglect around it made almost defiant. Abigail stood looking at it for a while. "Used to be better." She turned. An old woman had come around the corner of the outbuilding, small brown as bark with white hair, pinned severely back, and eyes that missed nothing. She was carrying a covered dish and moved with the confident ease of someone who had been walking this property for a long time. "Used to be Eleanor's," the woman said. She set the dish down on the fence post and looked at the garden with the particular expression of someone reviewing a long history. "Eleanor Walker, Caleb's wife. She had this garden going something beautiful. Tomatoes, squash, pole beans, herbs all down that far bed. Roses on the wall. That one there is all that's left of 6 she planted." "When did she die?" 6 years ago, November, fever." The old woman looked at Abigail with the directness of someone who had decided to stop softening things. "I'm Martha Green. I live in the 3rd house past the church. I knew you'd be up early. Brought biscuits, but I suppose you don't need them." "I could use the company," Abigail said. Martha looked at her for a moment, then retrieved her dish. "Come have coffee, then. I think there's still some. I made fresh. Even better." They sat on the porch, and Martha drank her coffee and told Abigail the things she needed to know about Harrow Creek, the things she wouldn't have learned from 4 formal letters written by a careful man. Who was trustworthy and who wasn't. Which of the ranch hands were good workers, and which were only good at appearing to be. The history of the town, which was short and violent in places, and ordinary in others, as frontier histories tend to be. The history of Caleb Walker, which was longer than she would have guessed, and ended as so many histories did in this territory, with a winter and a death. "He's not a bad man," Martha said. "He's a shut-up man. There's a difference." "I know the difference," Abigail said. Martha looked at her over the rim of her cup. "I imagine you do." She left after an hour, and Abigail went to find the garden tools. That evening, when the ranch hands came in for supper and found a proper meal pork stew with root vegetables, fresh bread, and the preserved peaches warmed with a little sugar and set out in bowls, the conversation at the table was different from what it had been. Not dramatically different, just a degree or two warmer, the way a room changes when someone opens a door to let in a little air. A man named Pete Dawson, who was the senior hand and had a face like weathered saddleback, said that the bread was good. He said it once and didn't repeat it, but he said it toward Abigail rather than to no one in particular, which was its own kind of statement. Caleb ate without comment again. After supper, when Abigail was washing up, Clara appeared at her elbow with a dish towel. "It's working," Clara said quietly. "I'm just cooking," Abigail said. "Don't underestimate cooking." Later that night, lying in the east-facing room, Abigail heard the ranch hands in the bunkhouse. The window was open to the warm, dark air. She heard one of them say something she couldn't make out. Then she heard another say, "Probably won't last 2 weeks." Then the first voice again low, making what sounded like a bet. She lay still and listened to the crickets in the distant cattle, in the particular silence of a place that is very far from anywhere she had ever been. She thought about the letter in her coat pocket, which she had still not fully read, only skimmed in the first shock of it. Her father's handwriting shaky, now telling her he was sick, that the farm was gone, that he was sorry in the way people are sorry when they have run out of other options. She thought about all of this, and then she thought about the rose bush on the wall of the neglected garden, putting out its yellow blooms anyway. She got up before 4 the next morning. The days accumulated. She was not, she told herself, trying to prove anything. She was simply doing what was in front of her to do. The garden wanted tending, and she tended it. The kitchen needed organizing, and she organized it. There was a crack in the plaster in the second hallway that had been letting in a draft, and she found plaster compound in the tool shed and repaired it one afternoon while the men were out on the range. On the fourth day, the cook who had been ill, a laconic man named Decker, who had been with Caleb for 7 years, appeared in the kitchen looking greenish and determined to resume his duties, and found Abigail making apple fritters for the hands' afternoon break. He stood in the doorway and assessed the kitchen, which was cleaner than it had been in his memory, and the food which smelled better than he was willing to admit. "Those aren't regulation apple fritters," he said. "No," Abigail agreed. "They're Missouri apple fritters. Bit different. Different how a little cardamom." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I can handle supper." "All right, you can take the fritters to the hands if you want." He took the fritters. He did not say they were good, but he came back for one while he thought she wasn't looking. On the 7th day, one of the hands' horses came up lame with an abscessed hoof, and Abigail, who had grown up on a farm and had dealt with more abscessed hooves than she could count, offered her help while the ranch's usual horse doctor was 3 hours away. The gap-toothed boy named Eli stood back and watched with undisguised surprise as she packed and wrapped the hoof with a confidence that spoke of genuine experience. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked. "Missouri," she said, which was where she seemed to have learned most things. Word got around as it does on a ranch, because men with nothing to read and a long ride between water sources will discuss almost anything at some length. And by the end of the second week, Pete Dawson had revised his estimate of how long she'd last, without telling anyone he had done so, which was its own kind of endorsement. On the 9th day, Abigail met Vivian Hart. She had heard the name before then in the particular way you hear a name in a small town dropped into sentences by people who aren't talking about that person, but are slightly talking about that person. Clara had said it once carefully, and Martha had said it twice less carefully. The second time Martha said it, she had been looking at something across the street rather than at Abigail, which told Abigail more than the words themselves. She was at the general store ordering supplies. The Walker Ranch account was in good standing. The storekeeper had confirmed almost with relief, as though it had been a while since someone had taken proper inventory. When the door opened and a woman came in, who made every other person in the store seem slightly less distinct. Vivian Hart was perhaps 35, though she could have been either side of that. She was tall and dark-eyed and wore a dress that was perfectly appropriate for noon on a Tuesday in Harrow Creek, while also being the most striking thing in the room. She moved with the ease of someone accustomed to being noticed, and looked at Abigail with an expression that took in everything and revealed almost nothing. "You must be Miss Whitaker," she said. Her voice was warm and measured. "I am," Abigail said. "You must be Miss Hart. Vivian, please." She smiled. It was a real smile, technically. "How are you finding Harrow Creek?" "Big sky," Abigail said. "Bigger than I expected." "It gets bigger," Vivian said. "The longer you stay, the more there is of it." She looked at the list in Abigail's hand. "You've taken over the Walker kitchen." "The cook was ill. I helped out." "How thoughtful." The word was perfectly weighted, not unkind on its surface, but carrying something beneath it, the way a river carries things you can't see from the bank. "Caleb is lucky to have such a capable woman at the ranch." She bought a packet of tobacco and left. Abigail watched her go and then turned back to the storekeeper, who was studying his ledger with great concentration. "She comes in regular," he said to the ledger. "I'm sure she does," Abigail said. On the 11th day, Clara told her about Eleanor. She told her in the garden where Abigail had cleared a good portion of the neglected beds and turned the soil and planted a row of beans and a row of squash from the seeds she'd found in the tin on the pantry shelf. They were almost certainly 2 years old and might not germinate, but you couldn't know until you tried. Eleanor Walker had been 26 when she married Caleb. She had been, by all accounts, bright and quick and genuinely beloved. Not the way people sometimes become beloved in memory, because the alternative is speaking ill of the dead, but actually beloved, the kind of woman who makes a community a little better than it would have been without her. She had run the ranch kitchen and the garden and had been one of the organizers of the church socials. She had been pregnant when she caught the fever, and both Eleanor and the child had died within 4 days of each other in November of a year that Clara couldn't say the number of without her voice changing. Caleb had not spoken of either of them in 6 years. "He manages," Clara said. She was pulling weeds from the near bed with the focused attention of someone who needs something to do with her hands. "He's a good manager. The ranch runs well. The hands respect him. He goes to church and he pays his debts, and he helps his neighbors when they need it." She pulled a long taproot free and tossed it aside. "He just doesn't live exactly, not in the way he used to." Abigail was quiet for a moment, pressing seeds into the turned soil with her thumb. "Is that why you arranged for a bride without asking him?" Clara sat back on her heels. "I arranged for a bride because he was going to turn into an old man alone in that house and never notice it was happening." She looked at Abigail steadily. "I didn't lie to the agency. I told them he was a widower who needed a wife, and that the arrangement would be genuine if the match was right. I just didn't tell him until it was too late to undo. He could have refused me at the station." "He thought about it," Clara said. "I could tell. He didn't, though." Abigail turned this over. "He offered me passage back." "He offered it. You didn't take it." Clara went back to weeding. "There's more there than you're getting credit for." She thought about this later, washing the garden soil from her hands at the pump. She thought about what it meant that a careful private man had let a stranger stay in his house for 10 days without renewing the offer of return passage. She thought about what it meant that he had apologized for what happened on the street quietly, man to man, because it was the right thing to do. She thought about what it meant that twice she had seen him watching her from across the yard with an expression she couldn't fully read. She did not build anything from these observations. She was 28 years old, and she had learned that certain kinds of hope were better saved until there was more ground to put them on. But she did not dismiss them either. She had not expected the animals to take to her the way they did. She was not a sentimental woman about animals. She had grown up on a working farm and understood that sentiment and livestock made poor partners. But there was a dog at the Walker Ranch, an old cattle dog named Buck, who had come with the property and who, by all accounts, had not shown interest in anyone except Caleb since Eleanor died. He was a gray-muzzled animal of indeterminate breed, moving slowly now, a little stiff in the mornings, and he had spent the first week of Abigail's time at the ranch observing her from a careful distance, with the suspicious dignity of an elder who reserves judgment. On the 12th day, he appeared at her feet while she was working in the kitchen garden and sat down. She did not make a fuss of it. She kept working and let him sit, and after a while he lay down in a patch of sun near the bean rows, and he was there the following morning when she came out before the others in the morning after that. Pete Dawson noticed. Pete Dawson noticed most things and remarked on almost none of them, but this he mentioned once to Caleb, and Abigail was not there to hear it, but Clara told her later what Pete had said. That dog hasn't laid in the garden since Eleanor. And what Caleb had said in response, nothing. He had looked at the garden for a moment and then gone back to the harness he was repairing. Clara told this without comment. Abigail received it without comment, but she carried it. Back to The ranch hands were not a monolithic thing. They were 6 individual men, 7 when Decker was well, with distinct personalities and histories and opinions, and the process by which they moved from skepticism to something warmer was neither uniform nor simple. Eli was youngest and had revised his opinion the fastest, partly from the direct shock of watching her pack the abscessed hoof, and partly because young men who have said stupid things tend to overcorrect in the opposite direction once they realize they were stupid. He became her loudest defender, which was occasionally more trouble than it was worth. Pete Dawson revised his opinion methodically, like a man who has a checklist, and is going through it. He watched her work. He asked her direct questions when he had them and received direct answers and filed them accordingly. His endorsement when it came the "you'll do all right here at the social" was the most valuable one she had received from anyone at the ranch, including Clara. A man named Reyes, compact and weathered, who had been with Caleb for 4 years and communicated primarily in monosyllables, showed his acceptance by starting to leave the morning chores list on the kitchen table rather than the bunkhouse door, which was his way of including her in the operation without requiring him to say anything about it. The others came along in their own time with their own reasoning, and by the end of the second month, she had the particular knowledge of each of them that you accumulate through proximity and attention, who was homesick and who wasn't, who had a family he was supporting elsewhere, who had some history that made him watchful around strangers. She held this knowledge the way she held most private things, carefully, without display. On the 14th day, she heard laughter in the house. Real laughter, not the polite, contained kind, but the startled, genuine kind that breaks out before you can stop it. She was in the kitchen when it started coming from the front room. She went quietly to the door and looked. A boy of about 6, the son of one of the hands, brought to the ranch because his mother was ill and there was nowhere else for him to go. For the afternoon had somehow gotten hold of Caleb Walker's good hat and put it on, and it had come down over his ears to his nose. And he was walking in circles with his arms out for balance, and Caleb Walker was standing by the fireplace laughing. It wasn't a big laugh. It was the laugh of a man who has forgotten how to laugh entirely and has just remembered, startled by the reminder that he is capable of it. It lasted perhaps 6 seconds before Caleb caught himself and cleared his throat and took the hat back. But Abigail had seen it. She went back to the kitchen and stood at the sink for a moment with her hands still in the dishwater, feeling something shift that she didn't yet have a name for. The town of Harrow Creek had a social gathering the third Saturday of every month at the Grange Hall, which was attached to the church and had been added the same year the town got a proper post office and began to believe it might not disappear. It was not a formal occasion. People brought food, and someone played fiddle, and there was dancing, if the mood was right, but it was the primary mechanism by which the community took its own temperature and attendance was expected. Clara told Abigail about it on Thursday. Caleb said nothing about it at all, which Clara later explained was how he agreed to things he was not going to say he agreed to. Abigail made a peach cake for the gathering. She also wore her batter dress, the one with the small blue flowers, which fit her well and which she had always thought was the best thing she owned in terms of the way it fell. She pinned her hair up simply. She was not going to the gathering to impress anyone. She was going because it was expected and because she was trying in the small, incremental way that was available to her to become someone the town recognized. The hall was already crowded when they arrived. A man with a fiddle was tuning up in the corner. Long tables held food from a dozen kitchens. Children ran between the adults' legs with the absolute immunity that small children have in gatherings like these. She saw the looks. Not all of them were unfriendly. Martha Green waved from across the room and made her way over with the purposeful speed of a small woman who has decided where she is going. A woman named Ruth Henley, whose husband ran the feed store, introduced herself with genuine curiosity and asked about the biscuits she had heard about from the ranch hands. Another woman, older, simply looked at Abigail with the considering expression of someone revising an opinion she hadn't finished forming. But there were others, a cluster of women near the refreshment table who went quiet when Abigail passed. A man who leaned to his neighbor and said something with his eyes on her. The neighbor laughed through his nose. She felt it on her skin the way you feel eyes even when you've decided not to look. She was setting her peach cake on the table when Vivian Hart materialized at her side. "What a lovely cake," Vivian said. She was wearing green tonight, which was, Abigail thought, a choice made by someone who knew exactly how it looked against dark hair and dark eyes in lamplight. "Thank you. It's ambitious bringing food to a social. People can be particular." She smiled. "But then you seem like someone who doesn't let that stop her." It was not a compliment. It was shaped like one, but Abigail had enough experience with the shape to know the difference. "We'll see how it goes over," Abigail said pleasantly. The cake went over well. By the end of the evening, there was none of it left, and 2 women had asked for the recipe, which was not a small thing. Ruth Henley's opinion completed its revision audibly. "She's not what I expected," she said to her husband, not quietly enough, which was the most honest endorsement Abigail had received from anyone who didn't already know her. She danced once with Pete Dawson, who was a better dancer than his expression suggested he would be. and who said, when the dance was over, "You'll do all right here," in the tone of a man who does not give assessments lightly and considers this one final. She was standing near the door, getting some air, when she became aware that Caleb Walker had been standing a few feet away watching her for some time. She turned her head and looked at him. He didn't look away immediately, which surprised her. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she still couldn't entirely read, thoughtful, perhaps a little troubled, and then he said, "You should be on the floor if you want." "I was taking a breath," she said. "The Dawson's boy plays fiddle about as well as his father, better than his grandfather at least." This was the longest non-practical thing he had said to her since she arrived. She matched his tone. "Were you close with the grandfather?" "We were boys together. He was better at poker than at fiddle, and he knew it. Played the fiddle anyway." A pause. "Some people do that." She wasn't sure if this meant something more than it said, or if she was looking for meaning in places. It wasn't because she wanted it there. She suspected the answer was somewhere in between. "The month is nearly half up," she said. He looked at the dancers. "I know. Have you given thought to what happens after—" He was quiet for a moment that she didn't try to fill. "Some. So have I." She watched the fiddle player who was attacking the strings with the earnest overkill of youth. "I'd like to stay, not because I have nowhere else to go. I've managed on less before. I'd like to stay because I think I can be useful here, and because—" She stopped. "Because I think this place could be good. The ranch, the town. I think it could be good." He turned and looked at her fully. It was the first time he had done that, actually looked at her the way you look at a person you are trying to know rather than assess. "It used to be better," he said. "Martha told me." Martha tells everyone everything. There was no bitterness in it, maybe the faintest suggestion of affection. "Maybe she knows something about what's necessary," Abigail said. He put his hat on. He'd been holding it again and looked at the dancers. "The month's not up yet," he said. She took this for what it was, not an answer, but a continued conversation, which was more than she'd had. She was standing near the door, getting some air, when she became aware that Caleb Walker had been standing a few feet away watching her for some time. She turned her head and looked at him. He didn't look away immediately, which surprised her. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she still couldn't entirely read, thoughtful, perhaps a little troubled, and then he said, "You should be on the floor if you want." "I was taking a breath," she said. "The Dawson's boy plays fiddle about as well as his father, better than his grandfather at least." This was the longest non-practical thing he had said to her since she arrived. She matched his tone. "Were you close with the grandfather?" "We were boys together. He was better at poker than at fiddle, and he knew it. Played the fiddle anyway." A pause. "Some people do that." She wasn't sure if this meant something more than it said, or if she was looking for meaning in places. It wasn't because she wanted it there. She suspected the answer was somewhere in between. "The month is nearly half up," she said. He looked at the dancers. "I know. Have you given thought to what happens after—" He was quiet for a moment that she didn't try to fill. "Some. So have I." She watched the fiddle player who was attacking the strings with the earnest overkill of youth. "I'd like to stay. Not because I have nowhere else to go. I've managed on less before. I'd like to stay because I think I can be useful here, and because—" She stopped. "Because I think this place could be good. The ranch, the town. I think it could be good." He turned and looked at her fully. It was the first time he had done that, actually looked at her the way you look at a person you are trying to know rather than assess. "It used to be better," he said. "Martha told me." Martha tells everyone everything. There was no bitterness in it, maybe the faintest suggestion of affection. "Maybe she knows something about what's necessary," Abigail said. He put his hat on. He'd been holding it again and looked at the dancers. "The month's not up yet," he said. She took this for what it was, not an answer, but a continued conversation, which was more than she'd had. She had not expected walking home from the social in the cold, clean night air, while Caleb drove the wagon and Clara sat between them, talking about nothing in particular, that she would feel the particular homesick ache of belonging somewhere, the ache that comes not from missing a place you love, but from loving a place that hasn't yet decided to love you back. It was different from the loneliness she had known in Missouri, which was the loneliness of being in a place that had made its mind up about her. This was the loneliness of possibility, which was harder in some ways because it required you to keep wanting something. She kept wanting it. She kept getting up before the others and making the biscuits and tending the garden and noting the small increments of change, the way Pete Dawson had started leaving his mug on the kitchen counter instead of taking it back to the bunkhouse, the way Reyes had shown her which fence post needed replacing without being asked. The way the ranch house, which she had first perceived as a clean and well-managed and utterly airless space, was beginning to have the quality of a place where someone lived rather than simply maintained. She found one evening a child's primer on the shelf in the sitting room, a small book with a cloth cover and a name written inside in a young hand, Eleanor Ann Walker. It had belonged to Eleanor as a child, apparently, and had been brought to the ranch when she came. Abigail held it for a moment, running her thumb over the name, and then put it back exactly where she had found it. She thought about the woman who had grown the garden and read in the evenings and named a dog Buck and filled this house with something that had taken years to leak out of it. She felt strangely no competition with that memory, only a kind of recognition, the way you recognize someone whose path you are following without ever having met them. She hoped wherever Eleanor Walker had gone, that she knew the rosebush was still blooming. 3 days later, a rumor reached her. It reached her through Eli, who was too young to have learned the art of not telling people things they would rather not know. He said it straight out at the breakfast table, while the other hands looked at various points on the ceiling that he'd heard in town that the Walker bride had come to Harrow Creek because she'd bankrupted some family back in Missouri and needed somewhere to hide. That her people were in disgrace back east. That she'd targeted Caleb Walker because he had land and money and no way to know better. The other hand said nothing, which was either the decency of men who didn't believe it or the silence of men who weren't sure. Abigail put down the coffee pot. She said carefully, "I came from Missouri on a legitimate contract through a legitimate agency. My character references were in the correspondence Mr. Walker received. Anyone who would like to read them is welcome to ask." There was a general looking at ceiling that indicated this had been the right response. Eli had the grace to look embarrassed. She went to find Clara. Clara already knew. Her expression when Abigail found her was the expression of a person who had been waiting for this to arrive and was angry that it had. "Vivian," she said simply, "you're certain." "I'm certain of the pattern," Clara said. "I can't prove the source. That's how she works. She doesn't say anything. She asks questions, just a few questions in the right ears, and the answers fill themselves in." Abigail sat down at the kitchen table. "What does she want?" Clara looked at her with the kind of patience you have for obvious questions. "Caleb, she could have him," Abigail said, and then heard how it sounded and added, "I mean, I don't have a claim on him. A month's trial and a contract don't make a marriage." "No," Clara said, "but Vivian's been waiting 5 years, and she knows something changed when you arrived. She can feel it even if she can't name it." She sat down across from Abigail. "And she's not wrong that something changed. You know that." Abigail looked at her hands, which had calluses now that hadn't been there a month ago, garden calluses and bread calluses, and the small scar from the day she'd caught the edge of the hoe wrong. "I'm not going to fight her," she said. "You don't have to fight her," Clara said. "Just keep doing what you're doing." What she was doing felt at that moment very precarious, but she went back to the kitchen and started lunch. She did not see Caleb Walker alone again until 2 days later when she was in the garden at dusk, and he came around the side of the house and stopped when he saw her kneeling by the bean rows. The seeds had germinated. It had surprised her more than it should have. She had planted them doubting, and they had come up anyway, small and green and determinedly ordinary, pushing through the soil with the patience of things that do not know they are not supposed to succeed. Caleb stood at the garden gate and looked at the rows. "I didn't think those would come up," he said. "Neither did I." He came a few steps into the garden. He stood with his hands in his pockets, which was new. He usually had something to do with his hands hat rope work. Standing with empty pockets meant he'd come out without a task. "I heard what was being said in town," he said. "I heard you heard," she said. "Clara has a good network." "It's not true." "No, I know it's not." He looked at the rosebush on the east wall, which had put out more blooms now. She had cleared the weeds from around it and worked some compost into the soil, and it was responding with the gratitude of something long neglected. "People talk. That's what this town does. Most towns do. I should have said something before this." He looked at her now directly. About whether you'd stay. I've been, I've been not saying it. I know that. You've had a lot to think through. It's not entirely that. He stopped. There was something working in him that she could see without being able to read it, the way you can see wind in grass without seeing the wind itself. You've been good for this place, he said finally. That's a true thing. Whatever else I don't know yet, that's true. She looked at the bean seedlings neat and green in the turned earth. I'd like to stay through the season, she said, if the arrangement still holds. A pause that was long enough to mean something. It holds, he said. She did not see Caleb Walker alone again until 2 days later when she was in the garden at dusk, and he came around the side of the house and stopped when he saw her kneeling by the bean rows. The seeds had germinated. It had surprised her more than it should have. She had planted them, doubting, and they had come up anyway, small and green and determinedly ordinary, pushing through the soil with the patience of things that do not know they are not supposed to succeed. Caleb stood at the garden gate and looked at the rows. I didn't think those would come up, he said. Neither did I. He came a few steps into the garden. He stood with his hands in his pockets, which was new. He usually had something to do with his hands hat rope work. Standing with empty pockets meant he'd come out without a task. I heard what was being said in town, he said. I heard you heard, she said. Clara has a good network. It's not true. No, I know it's not. He looked at the rose bush on the east wall, which had put out more blooms now. She had cleared the weeds from around it and worked some compost into the soil, and it was responding with the gratitude of something long neglected. People talk. That's what this town does. Most towns do. I should have said something before this. He looked at her now directly. About whether you'd stay. I've been not saying it. I know that. You've had a lot to think through. It's not entirely that. He stopped. There was something working in him that she could see without being able to read it the way you can see wind in grass without seeing the wind itself. You've been good for this place, he said finally. That's a true thing. Whatever else I don't know yet, that's true. She looked at the bean seedlings neat and green in the turned earth. I'd like to stay through the season, she said, if the arrangement still holds. A pause that was long enough to mean something. It holds, he said. She thought about what that meant. It holds for a long time after he had gone back to the house. It held. The arrangement held. A month's trial had become a season was becoming something else entirely, and the name for the something else was not yet on the table, but it was in the room. She thought about what it would mean to have this. Not in the breathless way that romance is sometimes described, not a swooning or a certainty, but in the practical, grounded way that she approached most things. To have this would mean this house was her house. This land was her land, in the sense that she could walk across it every day of her life without it being strange. The garden she had rebuilt would be her garden to tend and expand. The ranch hands whose histories and habits she knew now better than some of them knew themselves would be people she watched grow older. Martha would be her Martha. Clara would be her Clara. Caleb Walker would be... She stopped the thought there not because it was too much, but because it wasn't quite ready yet. Because the bravest things take time. The month became 2. The arrangement remained technically unchanged. She was at the ranch, the marriage had not been formalized. The situation existed in the ambiguous territory between a business understanding and something else, but the texture of daily life shifted in ways that were more significant than the formal status. Caleb began speaking to her at supper. Not at length, not with the openness of a man who has decided to be known, but in the incremental way of someone testing a bridge by putting weight on it one plank at a time. He told her one evening that the south pasture had needed reseeding for 2 years, and he hadn't gotten to it. She said she could help with that. He looked at her as if this were a strange thing to volunteer. It's heavy work. I know what reseeding looks like, she said. He told her another evening that Eleanor had liked to read in the evenings, and that the house had seemed quieter without the sense of someone present in a room in that contained private way that readers have. She had said, "You read, though," and he had said, "Not in the evenings. Evenings I work late or sleep." She had thought about this but not said anything. The following evening, she brought her copy of Jane Eyre to the sitting room after supper and read for an hour in the chair by the west window. She didn't say anything about it. She just did it. He came in from the porch after half an hour and sat in the other chair and opened the county almanac, and they read in the same room in silence, and it was, she thought, the most normal evening she had had in years. He came to the sitting room the following evening as well. The letter from Missouri had been sitting in her coat pocket for 3 weeks. When she finally read it properly, all of it, not just the first shock paragraph. She read it on a Sunday afternoon when the ranch was quiet and Caleb was checking the east fence line and Clara had gone to her friend Ruth's. She sat in the east-facing room with the letter spread on the writing table and read it through to the end. Her father, William Whitaker, was ill. The doctor in Independence had told him in March that the heart was giving out and that the summer would be the last summer most likely. He wrote this with the same flat practicality that had characterized everything he had ever said to her. William Whitaker was not a man who ornamented difficult things. But then in the last paragraph, he had written something she had not expected. I know I was not the father you deserved. The handwriting was unsteady with age and illness. I know what people said about you, and I know that I did not defend you as I should have. The farm is gone. I am not asking you to come back. I am telling you this because it seemed wrong to die without saying it to you. Whatever you have now, wherever you are, I hope it is better than what you left. She sat with the letter for a long time. Then she folded it along its original creases and put it back in the pocket of the coat on the hook behind the door. She sat at the writing table looking out the east window at the mountains, which were clear and enormous in the afternoon light. She thought about her father in the farmhouse outside Independence, the house that was someone else's now, apparently, and she thought about what it cost a man like William Whitaker to write that paragraph, and she thought that it was probably the bravest thing he had done in years, and that it had come too late for many things, but perhaps not for all things. She got her writing paper from the suitcase. She wrote back. She did not tell Caleb about the letter. She told herself this was because it was not his business, that the private history of her family was hers to carry, and not his concern in the context of what they were to each other, which was still formally undefined. This was partly true. The other part, the part she was less willing to look at directly, was that she was afraid. Not of his judgment, she had seen by now that he did not judge easily or carelessly, but of the vulnerability of the thing, of what it meant to show someone the part of yourself that is not capable or competent or making good biscuits in the dark before dawn, the part that is just a person who has a dying father. She barely knows how to mourn, and a family history she left in a hurry, and a stack of small shames that she carries with her everywhere she goes. She had been Abigail the capable, Abigail, the hard-working Abigail, who knows how to tend a garden and pack an abscessed hoof and make decent fritters with cardamom. She had built that carefully, and she wasn't sure she was ready to add Abigail, who got a letter. So she carried it. She carried it for 8 days, and then Vivian Hart made the carrying unnecessary. She never knew exactly how Vivian found out. The most likely explanation was that she had a correspondent in Independence, not unusual for a woman of Vivian's social intelligence, who understood that information had value and that the best time to have information was before you needed it. Possibly it had been the response letter sent from the Harrow Creek post office with the Walker Ranch as the return address that had been read or seen or simply noted by the right person. Whatever the mechanism, by the second week of July, Harrow Creek knew that Abigail Rose Whitaker's family had lost its farm, that her father was in disgrace, and that she had come west not simply for opportunity, but in flight from shame. Vivian hadn't announced these things at the church social or posted them in the general store. She had simply made them available the way water makes itself available to the downhill slope, by following natural channels, asking the right questions, allowing conclusions to form. The town had opinions. Pete Dawson said nothing and continued working, which was the most valuable endorsement she had. Eli looked at her with a complicated expression that might have been guilt. Decker made extra coffee without comment. But two of the hands she knew less well started eating their meals quickly and leaving. And in town, the women who had been warming toward her cooled perceptibly. And at the general store, the storekeeper hesitated before filling the Walker account order. Martha Green came by on a Tuesday. She sat down at the kitchen table and looked at Abigail steadily and said, Well, Abigail said, is any of it a lie? No, Abigail said. The farm is gone. My father gambled it away over several years. I knew the farm was in trouble before I left. I came here for a fresh start, not a hiding place, but I didn't exactly broadcast the circumstances. People don't, Martha said. That's not a crime. No, Abigail said. But it feels like one right now. Martha drank her coffee. What are you going to do? I don't know yet, Abigail said. I'm waiting to see what Caleb says. Have you told him? No. Martha set her cup down. Tell him before someone else does. She knew Martha was right. She had known it since reading the letter the first time. She had been waiting until she felt ready, and she was beginning to understand that ready was not something that was going to arrive on its own. She found him in the barn that evening mending a piece of harness by lamplight, with the methodical patience that seemed to be native to everything he did. He looked up when she came in. He could tell immediately that she hadn't come to tell him supper was ready. She stood a few feet inside the barn door and told him. She told him about the letter and her father and the farm and the debt, and the reason she had come west in more of a hurry than the formal arrangement strictly required. She told it plainly without embellishment in either direction, the way her father had written his letter to her flat, and without ornament, because ornamentation would have made it false. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. He turned the harness piece in his hands, looking at it rather than her. Why didn't you tell me before, he said. Because people always decide who I am before they know me. She said it before she had thought it through, and then she heard it and understood it was the truest thing she had said out loud in some time. I wanted you to know me first, before you knew the circumstances. He set the harness down. He looked at her now with the direct, unhurried look she had come to recognize, the one that meant he was actually looking, not assessing, not managing, but actually trying to see. My father drank, he said. Not your kind of story, but a story. My mother made the ranch work for years by doing two people's labor and never telling anyone why the accounts were always short. After he died, she told me and Clara and said we were never to mention it again, and we never did. A pause. So, she looked at him. So, he said again. She didn't know what she had expected. Not this economy of equivalence, this quiet offering of something equally private in return, like a trade made by hand without witnesses. She said, I should have told you sooner. Probably. He picked up the harness. I should have asked. He began working again. Supper almost ready. Yes, she said. She turned to go and then stopped. Caleb. He looked up. She didn't know what she had been about to say. Thank you seemed inadequate and also somehow wrong, like putting a frame around something that needed to stay unframed. So she just looked at him for a moment with all of it on her face, the relief and the residual shame and the gratitude and the something else she was still not naming. And he looked back and something passed between them in that ordinary barn light that was not words at all. Then she went to make supper. She was in the kitchen an hour later checking the bread in the oven when she heard the first rumble. She thought it was thunder. She went to the window and looked at the sky to the south, and what she saw was not clouds. The fire had started, they would learn later, from a lightning strike on the dry ridgeline, 8 miles south, where the switchgrass had been tinder dry for 3 weeks without rain. It had moved fast because fires in dry grass move the way water moves, finding the lowest resistance, the most available fuel, spreading outward and forward with a logic that has nothing to do with what stands in the way. By the time anyone in Harrow Creek understood what was approaching, the orange glow on the southern horizon had been visible for an hour and the wind had shifted to push it north. Caleb was on horseback before she had finished pulling the bread from the oven. Get to town, he said at the door. His voice was the voice of a man who has handled emergencies before and is not wasting breath on anything except the immediate. Bring everything from the larder that will travel. Wake anyone on the road who doesn't see it yet. Who's organizing at the Grange Hall? He paused, 1 foot already on the porch. He looked at her. Do it, he said. Then he was gone. Then, she had never been in a disaster before. She had been in hard winters in Missouri, and floods in spring, and the slow disaster of the farm going to pieces year by year. But she had never been in a disaster that moved like this, that was coming toward you visibly, that changed the quality of the air before it arrived, that made the animals in the barn call out and the horses pull against their halters, and the sky turn the color of an old bruise at the edges. She moved. She loaded the wagon with everything from the larder that was wrapped and sealed. She woke the 2 hands who were still on the property and sent one to alert the North Road Farms and one to help her. She drove to the Grange Hall, and she was not the first there. Martha Green had apparently seen the glow before anyone else and had already started lighting lamps and dragging tables into the center of the floor. Water, Martha said. We'll need all of it. On it, Abigail said. She organized because organizing was what was in front of her. She set up a food table because people in shock need to eat. She cleared the back rooms of the hall to make sleeping space because families would come with children. She sent a boy to the doctor's house to ask him to come, and found out the doctor was already at the edge of town watching the South Road, so she sent word that the hall was the gathering point. She put a woman who seemed to know medicines in charge of a table near the door, with cloth for bandages and the salve from the walker wagon. People came. They came in wagons and on foot, and some on horseback, with nothing but the clothes on their backs, because their property was to the south, and the fire was between them and everything they owned. They came with animals. 2 men arrived leading cattle by ropes because they hadn't known where else to take them. They came with children, some crying, and some with the stunned silence of children who have understood that something large is happening. Abigail moved through it all. She had not thought about whether she knew how to do this. She had not thought about whether she had the authority to do it. She simply did the next thing and then the thing after that, and because she was doing it with confidence and without panic, people followed. Ruth Henley appeared and took over the food table. Old Martha organized the sleeping spaces with military efficiency. The woman with the medicines became, with some guidance, a functional triage point for cuts and burns and smoke-hurt lungs. An hour into it, Vivian Hart arrived. She came through the door with 2 of her girls from the saloon, each carrying armloads of blankets, and she stopped when she saw what was already organized and looked around the hall. Then she looked at Abigail. Their eyes met. Vivian said, "What do you need, BT?" "Blankets in the back rooms," Abigail said, "and someone to keep track of who's come in and who's still out. Families need to find each other." Vivian took the blankets to the back rooms and then sat at a table near the door and began keeping a list. There was no time in that night for what was between them. There was only what needed doing. Caleb was with the fire crews to the south. She knew this. She tried not to think about it too directly because thinking about it directly would occupy a part of her she needed for other things. She kept the knowledge of it folded small the way she had learned to fold things, and she kept working. Around midnight, a family came in from the South Road. A man, a woman, and 3 small children, and the woman was telling anyone who would listen that there were children trapped at the Dawson homestead, the old Dawson place on the far South Road, because old Tom Dawson's grandchildren had been visiting, and the fire had come up the back ridge before anyone expected. Abigail looked at Martha. Martha looked back at her and said, "Don't. Someone has to know where they are," Abigail said. "The fire crews are working that direction. The fire crews are working the main line. Someone has to go to the homestead." She was already getting her coat. "Tell me how to get to the old Dawson place." Martha told her. Then, because Martha Green had been on this frontier for 40 years and had learned when argument was available and when it wasn't, she also found the one man in the hall who knew the South Road well enough in the dark to drive it, and that man drove while Abigail held on. The Dawson homestead was half a mile off the main fire line, which was why the crews had missed it. The fire had come up the back ridge and taken the outbuildings and was working on the main house from the south side. The 4 children, 3 boys and a girl, ranging from 4 to about 11, were on the north side of the house, where the farmhand who'd been watching them had pushed them before a burning crossbeam had come down on him. The farmhand was conscious but couldn't move. The girl, who was the oldest, had her arms around the other 3 and was talking to them in the quick, steady voice that older children use when they are terrified and can't afford to show it. She looked at Abigail arriving at the run and said, "He's under the beam. We couldn't get it off." The fire was not, Abigail estimated, immediately threatening the north side of the house. The main structure was old and dry, but the wind was still primarily pushing south to north, and they had perhaps 15 minutes on the north side. She moved the children first down to the road to the wagon to the driver, who had orders to take them south to the Grange Hall the moment she came back with the farmhand. The farmhand was a young man not much older than Eli, and the beam was across his legs. She assessed the beam. It was heavy enough that she couldn't move it alone, but the end of it rested on the collapsed frame of the porch railing, which gave her a fulcrum if she could find something to use as a lever. She found a fence post. She levered it under the beam and put her weight on it, which she had always been told was considerable, and the beam shifted. Not much. Enough. "Move," she said. The farmhand moved. She held the lever arm, shaking with the effort, until he was clear, and then she let it drop and caught him under the arm and walked him to the road. The oldest girl standing in the wagon said, "I told you she'd get him." The hall was over the course of those first hours a kind of ordered chaos that she worked to shape into something functional. People arrived disoriented and frightened, some having left so quickly they had brought nothing, not water, not food, not extra clothes for their children. She had what she had brought from the Walker larder and what people brought with them, and she worked with those materials the way she had always worked, using what was available and not mourning what wasn't. She found that organizing a crisis is at its core the same as organizing any household on a bad day. You identify what is most needed and address it first. You don't try to solve everything at once. You find the people who can help with specific tasks and put them on those tasks, and you let them own the work rather than supervising every detail. You stay calm, not because things are not frightening, but because your calm is something other people can borrow when they have run out of their own. Ruth Henley appeared and took over the food table without being asked, because Ruth had the instinct of a woman who sees what needs doing and does it. Old Martha organized the sleeping spaces with the authority of a former homesteader who has managed worse logistics than this. The woman with the medicines became, with some guidance, a functional triage point for cuts and burns and smoke-hurt lungs. An hour into it, Vivian Hart arrived. She came through the door with two of her girls from the saloon, each carrying armloads of blankets, and she stopped when she saw what was already organized and looked around the hall. Then she looked at Abigail. Their eyes met. Vivian said, "What do you need be his blankets in the back rooms," Abigail said, "and someone to keep track of who's come in and who's still out. Families need to find each other." Vivian took the blankets to the back rooms and then sat at a table near the door and began keeping a list. There was no time in that night for what was between them. There was only what needed doing. The children she found at the Dawson homestead ranged from 4 to 11, and it was the oldest, the girl whose name was Mary, and who had the steady gray eyes of a child accustomed to being the responsible one, who assessed Abigail's arrival and made a rapid calculation about whether to trust her. "He's under the beam," Mary said, and pointed at the farmhand. "I see him," Abigail said. "Are any of you hurt?" Tommy burned his hand on the fence. The second oldest boy, maybe 8, held up his hand. It was a minor burn, the kind that would blister but not scar. And Abigail took one look at it and said, "That's going to hurt for a few days and then it won't. Hold still." She poured a little water from the driver's canteen over it, wrapped it quickly with a strip from the hem of her petticoat, which was cotton and clean, and looked at Mary. "Can you keep him still?" "Yes," Mary said. She took Tommy's good hand and he stood still. Abigail moved to the farmhand. The beam had come down across his legs at the knee, heavy smoking at the far end, where the fire had touched it before the burning section of porch had collapsed away. He was conscious, a young man with a cut at his hairline from the falling masonry, and he was trying to move and couldn't. "Stop moving," she said. "You'll make it worse." The kids are fine. I need you to stay still so I can get you out. Can you do that?" He looked at her with the helpless fury of a person who wants to act and can't. "Yes." "Good." She assessed the beam. The driver of the wagon, whose name was Hollis, 62 years old with a bad knee and more sense than most, watched her work the fence post under the beam and put her weight on it and said quietly, "That's going to hold." "I know," she said. "Hold this." He held it while she got the farmhand's arms. The farmhand moved. She held the lever arms, burning with the effort until he was clear, and then she let it drop and caught him under the arm and walked him to the road with the steady, unhurried pace of someone who has finished the task and is not going to celebrate it before it is finished. The oldest girl standing in the wagon said, "I told you she'd get him." Abigail looked at her. "Did you?" "I told Tommy," Mary said with the simple certainty of a child who has made an assessment and is comfortable with it. "I said she'd get him." Abigail helped the farmhand into the wagon and got in beside him, and they went back to the road. She had not thought she would be seen. She had been thinking about the beam and the children and the farmhand and the angle of the lever, and she had not thought about the crew of 4 men from the fire line who had come up the South Road for water and had arrived at the Dawson Homestead Lane in time to see a heavy-set woman in a plain cotton dress levering a burning beam off a man's legs with a fence post and then dragging him to the road. Pete Dawson was one of the 4 men. He was also the one who told the story afterward, told it exactly as he had seen it without embellishment, because Pete Dawson didn't embellish, and everyone who knew him knew it, which was what made the story true in the way it needed to be true. The Grange Hall at 3 in the morning was a different place from what it had been at 9. The organized urgency had settled into something slower and heavier. Families asleep on the floor of the back rooms, children tucked under blankets, that Vivian's girls had spread, the doctor moving quietly between the people with burns and smoke damage. The fire word had come back, had been stopped at the second line. It had taken the South Ridge and 4 farmsteads and the grazing land at the valley's edge, but it had not reached the town itself. There was still no word on the main crew. Caleb had been at the primary brake line with 15 men. The brake had held, but the line itself had been compromised twice, and the last report, 2 hours old, said the crew was working the flank. She sat near the hall door and waited. She had done everything that was in front of her to do, and now there was nothing in front of her, and all she could do was wait. Martha sat beside her and didn't say anything, which was the right thing to do. Vivian sat across the hall by the window and also said nothing, and Abigail was aware, in the way you are aware of things in the periphery at 4 in the morning, that Vivian was also waiting. An hour before dawn, the crew came in. They came in groups of 2 and 3, smoke-dark, bone-tired, some of them burned at the hands and forearms. She checked them off against what she knew. She had the names she had been keeping track. 7, 8, 9, 10. Not Caleb. 12, 13. She stood up. The crew boss, a man named Hargreaves who ran a neighboring spread, came through the door and saw her standing, and his face did something complicated. Walker was at the secondary position, he said. Building came down, chimney collapse on the Welling property. I saw him go in. Which property? She said. Miss Whitaker. Which property, Mr. Hargreaves? He told her. She went back with 2 men and a wagon and a lantern, and they covered the 1.5 miles to the Welling property in a fog of smoke and pre-dawn gray that made the world look like something not quite finished. The Welling house was gone, the walls still standing, but the roof and the interior a low red glow of coals. There was no sign of anyone near the front. She went around the back. There was a stone-built root cellar accessed from the yard, its door half buried under fallen timber from the collapsed fence. It was the logical place. It was what she would have done. The 2 men with her heard at first a sound from under the timber, not loud, not clear, but present. She worked with them, the 3 of them, moving the fence timber, piece by piece, not quickly, because quickly would be wrong, because the structure above the cellar door was still unstable, and moving it wrong would bring it down. She moved methodically, assessing each piece before touching it, clearing the path. It took 40 minutes. The cellar door opened from inside before they had fully cleared it, pushed from below by a man who was not dead, but was badly burned on one arm and one side of his face, and had a gash above his right eye from the falling masonry. He came out into the pre-dawn air and stood upright, because he was Caleb Walker. And Caleb Walker would stand upright if he had to be held at both sides to do it. And then he saw her standing there with her hands full of splinters and her dress black with ash. And he said, without much space between the words, I thought I told you to go to the Grange Hall. I did go to the Grange Hall, she said. And then I came here. He looked at her for a moment. She could see the effort of it, the way the pain was trying to pull him back down. And he was not letting it. And then he said, Clara's going to be insufferable about this. Yes, Abigail said. She probably is. She took his good arm over her shoulder, and they walked to the wagon. The story of that night organized itself quickly in the way that stories do in small towns, shaped by the people who had seen the most and trusted by the rest, passed from person to person at the breakfast tables, in the general store, in the church steps on the following Sunday, until it had become the version everyone agreed on. Abigail Whitaker had run the Grange Hall relief effort from 9 o'clock until dawn. She had gone to the Dawson homestead in the dark and gotten 4 children and a farmhand out by herself. She had gone to the Welling property and dug Caleb Walker out of a root cellar. These were facts. They were verified by multiple witnesses who had no reason to make them larger than they were. The town of Harrow Creek updated its opinion. It did not do this all at once or with great fanfare. It did it the way towns do, incrementally, conversation by conversation, with the occasional backward glance to check whether the update was holding. Ruth Henley told her husband she'd been wrong, which was something Ruth Henley did rarely and meant considerably. The storekeeper filled the Walker order without hesitation and mentioned that the credit was good for anything she needed. 2 women who had been cool since the July gossip came to the ranch to help Abigail carry supplies to the families who had lost the South homesteads and the help was genuine and not strategic, and they knew it, and she knew it. Eli said, standing in the kitchen doorway on the morning of the third day after the fire, "I'm sorry for what I said about the money and the rest of it." "I know," Abigail said. "Sit down and eat." He sat down and ate. Caleb healed slowly. The burn on his arm was serious, not the worst kind. Not the kind that takes the deep layers, but serious enough to require daily attention and real time. She dressed it herself morning and evening with the salve the doctor had left in clean cloth that she washed and rewound each time. He bore this without complaint and with the stoic patience of a man who has done harder things, though she could tell from the set of his jaw when she was working on the worst of it that it cost him. He was confined to the house for the first week by doctor's orders, which he found considerably harder than the burn. She found him twice at the window watching the ranch work and redirected him both times with something that needed to be done at the kitchen table, which was the only way to make a man like Caleb Walker sit still, give him a task small enough to do with one arm. The second time she redirected him, she put the household ledger in front of him and asked him to check her calculations for the supply distribution she was running. He looked at the ledger for a moment and then at her. "You're checking your own math," he said. "These are right." "I know," she said. "I wanted you to have something to do." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't read, and then he looked back at the ledger and said, "This column should probably be broken out by family rather than by goods. Easier to track." She pulled up a chair. They worked on the ledger for 2 hours, and this was, she thought, one of the more remarkable things she had seen in her 28 years. A man who ran a cattle ranch with absolute competence, confined to his kitchen, and redirecting that competence toward a supply distribution ledger because a woman had handed him one and sat down next to him. It said something about him that she was still learning. They talked more in that week than they had in the entire 2 months before it. He talked about the ranch, not just the practical management of it, but the history of it, how his father had homesteaded the original 200 acres, and how he had expanded it over 20 years to what it was now. He talked about the land with the particular affection of someone for whom the land is not property, but something closer to character. He talked about Clara, who had been 14 when their mother died, and whom he had effectively raised with the combined uncertainty of a 20-year-old man doing his best. He talked about Eleanor. He talked about her on the fourth day in the kitchen in the late afternoon, while Abigail was making preserves from the windfall apples she'd collected before the fire, which had come down before the fire reached them from the tree at the south edge of the property. He talked about her the way he talked about everything, quietly, directly, without ornamentation. And she listened and stirred the preserves and understood that this was the first time in 6 years he had talked about Eleanor with someone who had not known Eleanor first. "She would have liked you," he said. She looked at the preserves. "Is that difficult?" she said. "To think about that." "It was," he said. "It used to be." A pause. "I don't think it is now. I don't know when it changed." She put the lid on the preserving jar and looked out the kitchen window at the afternoon light on the grass, which was golden this time of year. And she thought that she had come 4 days by rail and 2 by coach from Missouri, expecting a fair chance. And what she had gotten had not been that, not at the start, but it had become something else. Something she had not had a name for at the start and was beginning to find names for now. She said, "I wrote to my father." "I know," he said. "Clara told me. She didn't mean to." A pause. He's dying." The word didn't catch in her throat the way it had when she first read the letter. "He said he was sorry, in the letter. He's not a man who says that, so it cost him something." She looked at the preserving jars on the shelf, their contents glowing in the light. "I wrote back and told him about the ranch. I told him about the garden. I told him about the mountains." She paused. "I didn't tell him about you." She could feel him looking at her. "Should you have?" he said. "I didn't know what to say about you," she said honestly. "I still don't entirely." The kitchen was quiet except for the stove and the light sound of wind at the window. "I think," he said carefully in the way of a man putting weight on a bridge, "that what I said the night of the fire, what I said to you coming out of that root cellar, I think I owed you something less like a complaint." She turned and looked at him. "You went there," he said. "You went there knowing—" He stopped. "I owe you better than that." "You owed me nothing," she said. "I went because you were there." He looked at her for a long moment with the direct, unhurried look she knew now, and something in his face was different. Not the careful management she had seen in the early weeks, the deliberate arrangement of expression, but something underneath that, something less organized. He stood up from the table, which he did too quickly for a man with one arm working, and put his good hand on the kitchen table to steady himself. And she was already moving toward him with the reflex of someone who has been watching for a week for this kind of wrong move. And they ended up very close together, closer than they had been, and he looked at her from that distance, with all the careful management fully gone. And she could see it all, the grief and the years and the longing and the fear of it, and the decision to be done with the fear. He kissed her. It was a careful kiss, tentative in the way of something that has been held at a distance for a long time, and is finally being allowed to approach. And it lasted only a moment, and when it ended, he stood looking at her with the expression of a man who has done something he cannot undo and finds he does not want to. "I've been bad at this," he said. "Yes," she said, "you have. I'm going to try to be better at it." "All right," she said. "I'll let you know how you're doing." Something moved across his face that was, she thought, the beginning of a smile. The months that followed were the months of rebuilding. Harrow Creek came back to itself the way frontier communities do not, with the ease of people who have never lost anything, but with the practical determination of people who know that what has been lost must be rebuilt before winter, and that winter in this territory doesn't wait on grief. The community organized work parties. Families whose homes had burned lived with neighbors. The church organized collections of timber and supplies. Fences went up. New foundations were laid. Abigail was in the middle of it. Not because she had appointed herself, and not because Caleb had asked her to be. Because by October of that year, when people in Harrow Creek needed something organized, they went to her. They went to her because she knew the families and their situations and what they needed. They went to her because she was at the Walker Ranch, and the Walker Ranch was one of the largest and best resource spreads in the valley. And people understood that she had something to do with the fact that its resources were being made available. She organized a community kitchen through the worst of the reconstruction weeks, 3 mornings a week at the Grange Hall, where families working on their rebuilding could come and eat without having to cook first. She organized the collection and fair distribution of donated supplies from neighboring towns, which required a ledger and a process, and a person willing to sit at the table for 4 hours on a Saturday and take the measure of every donation and need. She organized, with Martha's help and the minister's approval, a collection for the families with children who had lost their winter stores. The community kitchen was where the real work happened. In her opinion, not the supply distribution, though that was necessary, but the kitchen, the gathering of it. Because when people came to eat, they talked. And when they talked, they started to understand who had what kind of need and who might be able to help fill it. A family that had lost fencing material discovered that another family 2 miles away had salvageable posts from their burned barn. A woman who had lost her chickens was given a dozen laying hens by a woman who had 40 and could spare them. A man with a broken wagon wheel and no tools discovered that Reyes, the Walker Ranch hand, had both the tools and the skill to fix it and would do so on Sunday. Abigail did not arrange all of these things. She simply made the space where people talked, and the rest arranged itself, which was, she thought, the most honest form of help. The kind that works whether or not the person who started it is watching. The women of the town, who had looked at her sideways since July, now came to her kitchen. Not all of them at once and not uniformly, but steadily, in the way that trust moves one person at a time. Ruth Henley became something close to a friend. She was practical and direct, and she said what she thought, which Abigail had always found easier to deal with than people who didn't. Martha was already her surrogate grandmother, her guide and confidant, and the person who knew where all the bodies were buried metaphorically, and in some cases possibly literally. Clara, who had started all of this with a letter to an agency in Kansas City, became someone she felt she had known for years. Vivian Hart was another matter. They did not speak after the fire with any substance for 2 months. They saw each other in town and were civil with the precise, calibrated civility of two people who have made a calculation that open hostility would cost more than it would gain. Vivian had organized a supply collection from her own network after the fire, which was substantial, and had delivered it without announcement and without any apparent expectation of credit. This was, as Martha observed, either a genuine change of heart or a very long game, and it was not possible from the outside to be certain which. In October, Vivian came to the Walker Ranch. She came on a Tuesday afternoon when Caleb was on the range, and Clara was at Ruth's, and Abigail was in the kitchen making bread. She knocked on the door properly, and Abigail opened it, and they looked at each other. "I owe you an apology," Vivian said. "Several, actually." Abigail opened the door further and stood aside. Vivian came in and sat at the kitchen table with the careful posture of someone who has prepared for a difficult thing. Abigail poured coffee. "The things I said," Vivian began, "the things I arranged to be said, about your family and the farm." She looked at her hands around the cup. "I knew it would hurt you. I knew it would hurt you more than it would affect him, that was the point, actually, to make you want to leave." She looked up. "I'm not going to tell you I didn't know what I was doing. I knew." Abigail waited. "I've wanted Caleb for a long time." Vivian said it without self-pity, which was the honest version of it. "Not just wanted. I thought I had convinced myself that it was only a matter of time, that he would see eventually what was in front of him, that I was—" She stopped. "I was wrong about what he needed. I think I was wrong about what I wanted also, or at least about why I wanted it. Some of it was about what marrying Caleb Walker would mean. Not about Caleb Walker." She paused. "I've been thinking about the difference." Abigail drank her coffee and said nothing. "I watched you that night," Vivian said. "The fire night. I watched you organize that hall, and I watched those people follow you, and I watched you leave to go to the Dawson place in the dark." She looked at Abigail steadily. "I know who you are. I've known for months. I was afraid of you. I wasn't trying to—" "I know that. That's the thing that was hardest." Vivian set her cup down. "You weren't trying to take anything. You were just here, being who you are." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry, genuinely. Not because I need something from you now. I'm sorry because it was wrong." Abigail looked at the woman across her kitchen table, smart, honest in this moment, carrying her own history, and thought about what forgiveness was for. Not for the forgiven person she had come to think. Not primarily. For the person who was tired of carrying the weight of the grudge. "I accept the apology," she said. "And I mean that." Vivian's breath released. It was small, controlled, but Abigail saw it. "Will you stay for supper?" Abigail asked. Vivian looked surprised. "I don't want to—" "Stay if you want to," Abigail said. "We're having pot roast." Vivian looked at her for a moment with something that was not quite the expression Abigail had expected. Not gratitude exactly, but something more like relief. The kind that comes from discovering that the story you were in does not have to end the way you feared it would. "All right," she said. "I'll stay." Caleb came home that evening to find Vivian Hart at his kitchen table eating pot roast, and his expression went through several stages before settling into a kind of careful neutrality that Abigail recognized as his face for, "I have questions I am not going to ask right now." Vivian was composed and direct. She said, "I owe you an apology as well, but it will keep. I came to apologize to Miss Whitaker, and she was kind enough to feed me afterward." Caleb sat down and reached for the pot roast and said, "All right," which was, Abigail thought, as much as you could ask of him, and enough. She received a final letter from her father in November. It came via the minister in Independence who had been with him at the end. William Whitaker had died on the 10th of October, which was a cold, clear day in Missouri, and the minister wrote that he had died easily in the way that people who have gotten their accounts in order sometimes can. He had asked the minister to forward Abigail's last two letters, which he had read and reread and kept on the table beside him at the end. She read the letter in the east-facing room on the edge of the bed where she had first arrived back in June, tired and humiliated and holding her suitcase with both hands. The room was different now. Her mother's hairbrush on the writing table, the quilt she'd made through the summer evenings, the small jar of dried yellow roses from the garden's east wall sitting on the windowsill. She read the letter and she cried finally quietly by herself, the way she hadn't allowed herself to do in June, when there was too much to do and too much to prove. She cried for the farm and for the man who had lost it, and for the relationship they had never quite managed to have, and for the letter that had come too late and also somehow not quite too late, because she had written back and he had read it, and the mountains were in it, and the garden, and something of what she was finding here, and he had died knowing she was somewhere real and good. She cried for perhaps 20 minutes. Then she washed her face at the basin and went to find Caleb. He was on the porch in the late afternoon watching the last light on the grass. She sat down in the other chair and told him about the letter. He listened without interrupting, and when she was done, he reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand. He held it with the same careful certainty with which he did everything. Not loosely, not desperately, just there, present his hand around hers. They sat like that for a while, watching the light leave the mountains. "I need to tell you something," he said eventually. "All right?" "When Clara arranged this, when I came to the stagecoach and I said what I said, there must be some mistake. I've been—" He stopped. "I've been ashamed of that since the first week. I should have told you that. You apologize for the crowd. I apologize for the crowd. I didn't apologize for my own face." He looked at her. "For the look on my face when I saw you. I knew what it said. I saw you see it." She was quiet for a moment. "You weren't wrong that it wasn't what you expected." "I was wrong about what it meant," he said, "about what the expectation was worth." He turned so he was looking at her fully, the way she had first seen at the Grange Hall in July, the way she had come to trust because it meant he was actually looking and not managing. "I needed someone to teach me how to live again. I didn't know that. I don't know what I thought I needed. Less than this." He paused. "Less than you." The evening light was soft on the porch, and the mountains were going blue in the distance, and somewhere across the yard she could hear the horses in the corral and the steady sound of the ranch at rest. She looked at the man beside her, carefully guarded for 6 years, and opening slowly like the garden gate she had oiled back in July so it didn't stick. "Is that a proposal?" she said. He hadn't been expecting that. Something moved across his face that was fully a smile, the real version of the one she'd glimpsed that day in the kitchen, unhurried, a little surprised at itself. "Not yet," he said. "I'm doing this properly." "All right," she said. "When you're ready." He was ready in December. He did it properly, as he had said, not on the porch or in the kitchen, but on a Sunday afternoon when the snow was just beginning to come down in the light, soft way of early December, and he had gotten her out to the garden on the pretense of checking whether the beans had been properly mulched for winter, and he had the ring that had been his mother's ring resized at the jeweler in town on one of the supply runs, and he got down on one knee in the snow-dusted garden with the yellow rose bush behind him, putting out the last of its autumn blooms. He had clearly thought about what he was going to say. She could tell because he started it and then stopped, and the thing he started with was something prepared, and the thing he said instead was something true. He said, "You told me in June that you came here for a fair chance. I didn't give you that at the beginning. I want to give it to you now, a proper one, for keeps." She looked at him kneeling in the garden with the snow on his hat and the ring in his hand and the mountains behind him going white, and she thought about what it meant to have come this far from Missouri and to have ended here in this garden. She had grown from neglect with this man she had found behind all his careful walls. She thought about what he had offered her on that first evening passage back. She thought about the biscuits made in the dark before dawn when no one asked her to make them. She thought about the beam and the root cellar and the kitchen table with the ledger between them in the lamplight. "Yes," she said. He stood up and put the ring on her finger, and she put her hands on both sides of his face and kissed him there in the garden in the early snow, and the yellow rose bush didn't care about any of it and kept blooming anyway. Clara, who had not been invited but had been watching from the kitchen window, made a sound that she later described as being caused by something in her eye. Derek. The engagement was the talk of Harrow Creek for approximately 48 hours, which was the natural attention span of a town that had other things to manage and which had in some sense been watching this outcome approach for months and was not entirely surprised by its arrival. Ruth Henley said she had known since the social in July. Martha said she had known since the second week. Pete Dawson said nothing and allowed himself one small nod when Caleb told him which was the equivalent in Pete Dawson's emotional vocabulary of throwing his hat in the air. Decker made a cake. He did not announce that he was making a cake. He simply produced one at supper the day after the announcement, set it on the table, and sat down. It was a spice cake with dried apple filling that was, Abigail thought, genuinely excellent, and she said so. Decker said, "I knew your cardamom trick was going to be useful," which was from Decker something very close to warmth. The wedding was in February in the Harrow Creek church. The minister had married more frontier couples than he could count and performed the ceremony with the particular warmth of a man who has seen enough hard years to know when a good one arrives. The church was full, not just Harrow Creek, but families from neighboring spreads, people who had heard the story as it had been told through the valley over the winter months. The story of the woman on the stagecoach and what she had become. Clara sat in the front pew with Ruth Henley's children in her lap, because that was where they had decided to be, and she had the expression of a woman who has arranged exactly one thing in her life that she is unequivocally proud of. Martha Green wore her best dress, which was navy blue, and had been her mother's, and she sat straight-backed and dry-eyed for the most part, though Abigail saw her take out her handkerchief at one point and use it with the businesslike efficiency of a woman who does not consider crying at weddings an indulgence but a simple acknowledgement of facts. Vivian Hart was there. She sat near the back, and she was by every measure the most elegantly dressed person in the room, and she watched the ceremony with an expression that was honest in its complexity, glad perhaps in the way of someone who has finally let go of something heavy and carrying some sadness with the gladness and all of it real. Pete Dawson was there standing with the other ranch hands along the back wall because there weren't enough pews for everyone, and he had polished his boots. The fiddle player from the social played during the processional better than he had at the social, which confirmed her suspicion that he had been practicing. Abigail walked the aisle in the blue dress with the small flowers, which she had altered to add a panel of ivory lace she'd found at the general store, and she carried the last of the yellow roses from the east wall, brought in from the cold, and opened in a glass of warm water. Overnight, 4 roses that had made it. She walked toward Caleb Walker, who was standing at the front of the church, looking at her with the direct, unhurried look she had come to know as the look of a man who was actually seeing you, and she thought about the stagecoach in June, and the dust and the laughter and the words that had been meant to be quiet and weren't. She thought about the biscuits in the garden and the barn and the root cellar in the pre-dawn dark. She thought about the letter from her father and the snow in the garden and the ring that had been his mother's. She thought about what it had cost to come here and what it had made. She thought, this is what a fair chance becomes when you don't let go of it. She reached the front of the church and took Caleb Walker's hand. He had barely said 2 words about her to his friends in the early days, she knew that, and did not hold it against him because people earn the right to be spoken of, and she had been earning hers. But on the day after the wedding, when the snow was coming down properly, and they were sitting at the kitchen table with coffee, and the ranch was doing what ranches do in February, which is, wait, he said something she hadn't expected. He said, I told Pete this morning that I was the luckiest man in the valley. She looked up from her cup. He was looking at the table, which was what he did when he said something that had cost him something. He said he'd been saying that since July, he added, which means he was saying it before I knew it, which is that's Pete. Pete Dawson, she said, is a very perceptive man. He thinks he's owed a raise. He probably is. Caleb looked up, and they looked at each other across the kitchen table. The two of them in the ordinary winter light of a working ranch, and the coffee was hot, and the snow was coming down, and the ranch hands were in the barn, and somewhere in the house, Clara was singing something slightly off-key to herself, and all of it was entirely ordinary, which was the most extraordinary thing she had ever found. Later, much later, when people who had been in Harrow Creek in that year told the story, and they told it because it was a good story, and good stories have a way of surviving, they said that the frontier had judged her by the space she occupied, the size of her, the history she came with, the family she'd left. They said that in the end, they had learned that her heart was bigger than any of it. What they meant, though none of them put it quite this way, was that she had come into the town with nothing but her suitcase and her mother's hairbrush, and a worn copy of a novel about a woman who refused to be made small. And she had refused to be made small, and the town had been better for it. Not because she had beaten anyone or proven anything with great fanfare. Because she had planted seeds in September that everyone said would never come up, and she had kept planting them, and in the end, the whole valley had eaten from the garden. She had never stopped being kind when the world gave her reasons to become bitter. That was the whole of it. That was enough.